The snow had been falling since dawn, covering Dove Hollow in a shroud of white that muffled even the loudest sounds from the street. Maribeth Cole stood at her parlor window, watching the flakes drift past like lost souls seeking rest. Her reflection in the frost-edged glass showed a woman of 30 winters, dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her mourning dress still black as coal, though 2 years had passed since Samuel's accident in the mines. The house felt larger in winter. Every corner held an echo, every shadow a memory. She turned from the window and returned to her sewing table where a pile of mending waited Mrs. Henderson's torn Sunday dress, young Tom Miller's work shirts, the parson's wife's delicate lace collar. This was her life now, threading needles, patching tears, making whole what others had torn. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, the needle dancing through fabric like a silver fish through dark water. A knock at the door interrupted her rhythm. Unusual for this hour. Most folks came by in the afternoon when the light was better for examining their damaged goods. Maribeth set down her work and smoothed her skirts, preparing the polite but distant smile she'd perfected since becoming the town's young widow. Sheriff Daniels stood on her porch, his hat in his hands despite the falling snow. "Morning, Mrs. Cole. Sorry to disturb you." "Sheriff." She nodded, not inviting him in. The last time Law had come to her door, it was to tell her about the cave-in, about how quick it had been, how Samuel hadn't suffered. "Got a message for you." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "Fellow asked me to deliver it personal-like. Said it was about some mending work." Maribeth took the envelope, noting the unfamiliar handwriting on the front. Just her name in careful, deliberate letters. "Who sent it?" "Jonas Reddick. Lives up past Miller's Ridge, at the old snow station. Keeps to himself mostly." The sheriff shifted his weight, snow gathering on his shoulders. "Lost his wife last winter. Got a little girl up there with him." The name was vaguely familiar, the way all names in a small town eventually become known, even if the faces remain strangers. Maribeth thanked the sheriff and closed the door, waiting until his footsteps faded before opening the letter. Inside was a single line. "I heard you mend things. My daughter's coat is torn." Below it, directions to his place north past the ridge. Follow the creek until it bends east. Look for the house with the red door. No pleasantries. No explanation of how he'd heard of her work. No mention of when she might come. Just the bare bones of need laid out in ink. Maribeth read it twice more. Something about the simplicity of it catching her attention. Most folks who came to her door talked too much, filled the silence with chatter about the weather, their families, their troubles. This man had written only what was necessary, nothing more. She folded the letter and placed it on her sewing table, returning to Mrs. Henderson's dress. But her mind wandered to that house beyond the ridge, to a man raising a daughter alone, to a coat that needed mending. Winter was hard on children's clothes, all that playing in snow, catching on fence posts, wearing thin at the elbows from constant use. By evening, Maribeth had finished the dress and started on the shirts. The letter sat beside her thimble, drawing her eye between stitches. She'd heard stories, of course. Everyone in Dove Hollow had. How Ruth Reddick had gone out for firewood during a blizzard and hadn't come back until spring, frozen solid not 50 yards from her own door. How Jonas had searched for her all night, lantern in hand, calling her name until his voice gave out. How the little girl still asked when Mama was coming home. Maribeth understood that kind of loss, the sudden absence that turned a home into a hollow shell, the way grief settled into your bones like winter cold. She'd stopped setting Samuel's place at the table after 6 months, but sometimes she still caught herself saving the crusty end of the bread loaf, his favorite part. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having moved on during the night. Maribeth packed her sewing basket with extra needles, good thread, and scraps of sturdy fabric that might serve as patches. She dressed warmly wool dress, thick shawl, her winter boots that Samuel had bought her their last Christmas together, The letter went into her pocket, though she'd memorized the directions. The walk took longer than expected. The fresh snow made the path treacherous, and more than once Maribeth had to catch herself against a tree trunk. But the morning was beautiful in that sharp, crystalline way of winter. Every branch outlined in white, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. She found the creek easily enough, followed it through a stand of pine that blocked out most of the light. When she emerged on the other side, she saw it a modest log house with a red door, smoke rising from the chimney, looking exactly like what it was a place where Loss lived. The red door opened before she could knock. Jonas Reddick filled the door frame, taller than she'd expected, broader too. His face was all angles and shadows, gray eyes the color of winter sky, dark hair that needed cutting. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, wool shirt, suspenders, but they were clean, carefully maintained. "Hey, Mrs. Cole." Not a question. He'd been expecting her. "Mr. Reddick, I received your note about the mending." He stepped aside to let her in, and she caught the scents of wood smoke, coffee, something baking. The main room was simple but neat, a few pieces of handmade furniture, a braided rug before the hearth, books on a shelf. And there, in a chair too big for her small frame, sat a girl of perhaps 6 years. The child had her father's gray eyes but lighter hair, tangled despite what looked like recent attempts at braiding. She wore a dress that had seen better days and clutched a rag doll missing one button eye. She stared at Maribeth without blinking, without smiling, without any of the curiosity children usually showed to strangers. "Callie," Jonas said quietly. "This is Mrs. Cole. She's come about your coat." The girl said nothing, just continued that steady stare. Maribeth had seen that look before in her own mirror those first months after Samuel died. The look of someone trying to understand why the world had changed without warning. Jonas fetched the coat from a peg by the door, navy wool. Good quality, but showing hardware. The tear ran from the shoulder to elbow, too large to have been made by simple play. Maribeth examined it with professional eyes, already planning the repair. "I can fix this," she said, "though it may take some time. The fabric's thick." "Take whatever time you need." Jonas moved to the stove, poured coffee without asking if she wanted any. The cup he handed her was blue with small painted flowers, a woman's cup. She noticed his wife's. Maribeth sat at the table and began her work, aware of 2 pairs of gray eyes watching her every movement. The only sounds were the fire crackling, her needle moving through wool, and somewhere in the walls, the settling of old wood. After a time, Callie slipped from her chair and came closer, still clutching her one-eyed doll. She stood just out of reach, watching Maribeth's hands work the needle. "What happened to your doll's eye?" Maribeth asked gently, not looking up from her work. A long pause, then, barely a whisper, "It fell off." "I could fix that too, if you'd like." The girl looked at her father, who nodded slightly. She placed the doll on the table with careful hands, as if it were made of spun glass. Maribeth found a suitable button in her basket, matched the thread to the doll's face. Such small stitches for such a small thing. But she took the same care she would with any task. When she handed the doll back, now whole again, Callie's eyes widened slightly. Not quite a smile, but something loosened in that small face. "Don't go yet," the girl whispered, then fled to the far corner of the room, as if frightened by her own words. Maribeth looked up to find Jonas watching his daughter, pain etched in every line of his face. He cleared his throat, turned back to the stove. "She doesn't speak much to strangers," he said. "Doesn't speak much at all these days." Maribeth returned to the coat, her fingers steady despite the tightness in her chest. She knew about words that wouldn't come, about the silence that grief brought. Sometimes it was easier to say nothing than to risk the dam breaking. By the time she'd finished the repair, the sun had climbed high enough to send slanted rays through the front window. The coat looked nearly new, the tear invisible unless you knew where to look. She folded it carefully, set it on the table. "That's fine work," Jonas said, examining the repair. He reached for a small leather pouch on the mantel. "What do I owe you?" $2, Maribeth said. "The standard rate for such work." He counted out the coins without haggling, placed them in her palm. His hands were calloused, working hands, but gentle in their movements. As she prepared to leave, packing up her basket, Callie appeared at her elbow again. The child said nothing, just stood there with her mended doll, but something in her expression asked what her voice could not. "Perhaps," Maribeth said carefully, looking at Jonas. "If you have other mending that needs doing, you could bring it to town. Save me the walk." "We don't go to town much," he said quietly. "Callie finds it difficult." The child pressed closer to her father's leg, and Maribeth understood. Too many pitying looks, too many well-meaning questions about how they were managing. Sometimes it was easier to stay where the silence didn't need explaining. "Then perhaps," she heard herself saying, "I could come back if you have more work, that is." Jonas studied her face for a long moment, those gray eyes seeing more than she'd intended to show. Then he nodded once, a gesture so small she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. "There's always something needs mending," he said. Maribeth took her leave then, stepping back into the bright winter morning. The walk home seemed shorter, or perhaps her mind was too full to notice the distance. She thought about gray eyes and small silences, about a coat torn beyond what any game could cause, about a child who whispered to strangers not to go. That night, as she sat by her own fire with her endless mending, Maribeth found herself looking north, toward the ridge, somewhere beyond those dark pines. A father and daughter sat by their own hearth, wrapped in their own silence. She wondered if the little girl was holding her newly whole doll, if the mended coat hung ready for tomorrow's wear, if Jonas Reddick was reading one of those books from his shelf or simply staring into the flames, seeing faces that weren't there. She picked up her needle again, began work on Tom Miller's shirts, but her thoughts kept drifting to that house with the red door, to the way Jonas had said, "There's always something needs mending." Not just clothes, she thought, not just tears and fabric. The letter still lay on her table, that single line of careful script, such a simple request. But Maribeth had lived long enough to know that the simplest words often carried the greatest weight. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept Samuel's last letter home, the one about the new vein they'd found, about how their fortune was about to change. Outside, snow began to fall again, erasing the tracks she'd made that morning, covering the path to Miller's Ridge in fresh white. But Maribeth knew she would find her way back. Some paths, once taken, demanded return. In the drawer, 2 letters lay side by side, one from a man who would never write again, one from a man who'd written just enough. Tomorrow she would wake to her quiet house, take up her needle, mend what others had torn. But tonight, she allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to mend something that couldn't be held in her hands, something that required more than thread and patience. The snow continued falling, soft and steady, covering Dove Hollow in its familiar embrace, and somewhere beyond the ridge, she imagined, a lantern burned in a window, waiting for someone to come home. 3 days passed before Maribeth made the journey again. The morning broke cold and clear, with a kind of brittle brightness that made the snow sparkle like crushed glass. She'd found reasons to delay Mrs. Henderson needed her dress back urgently. The parson's wife had brought 3 more collars. Her own hearth needed tending, but the truth was simpler. She wasn't sure why she was going back. There had been no new message, no request for her services. Yet something pulled her northward, beyond Miller's Ridge, toward that house with the red door. Perhaps it was the memory of Callie's whispered plea, or the way Jonas had said there was always something that needed mending. Or perhaps it was simply that she understood their silence too well. She packed her basket as before, adding a few peppermint sticks she'd bought from the general store. Children liked peppermint, didn't they? Samuel had always brought them home for the neighbor children, back when they'd still hoped for children of their own. The path was easier this time, her boots finding their old tracks beneath the fresh powder. The forest seemed less dark, the creek's bend less sharp. Familiarity bred comfort, even in the wilderness. When she emerged from the pines, the house stood exactly as before, smoke rising, red door closed, windows reflecting the morning sun like eyes. This time she knocked. Footsteps approached, heavier than a child's, but hesitant. The door opened slowly, and Jonas stood there in his work clothes, a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw. He looked surprised, but not displeased, stepping aside without a word. The house smelled of wood smoke and something else burnt bread. Perhaps. Callie sat at the table, a slate before her, making careful letters with chalk. She looked up when Maribeth entered, those gray eyes wide and watchful. Mrs. Cole, Jonas finally spoke, his voice rough as if from disuse. We weren't expecting. I was passing by. Maribeth lied smoothly. Thought I'd check that the coat repair was holding. He fetched the coat from its peg, handed it over for inspection. The mend was perfect. Of course her work always held, but she made a show of examining it, aware of Callie watching every movement. Still strong, she pronounced, handing it back. Then, as if just remembering, I brought something for Callie. The peppermint sticks emerged from her basket, wrapped in brown paper. The child's eyes went to her father first, seeking permission. At his nod, she approached slowly, took the gift with both hands. Thank you, she whispered, then retreated to her chair, clutching the candy as she had her doll. An awkward silence fell. Maribeth stood in the middle of the room, basket in hand, suddenly aware she had no real reason to be there. Jonas cleared his throat, gestured toward the table. Would you care for coffee? I was about to make a fresh pot. She should refuse, make her excuses and leave. Instead, she found herself settling at the table, watching as he moved about the kitchen area with surprising grace for such a large man. The coffee, when it came, was strong and bitter, a man's brew, unused to female preferences. Callie's practicing her letters, Jonas said, filling the silence. Her mother was teaching her before. The sentence died unfinished. Callie hunched lower over her slate, chalk squeaking against the surface. Maribeth could see the letters from where she sat careful, wobbly attempts at CALLIE. That's very good, she said gently. The curves on your C are just right. The girl's hand stilled. She looked up through her tangled hair, something almost like interest flickering in her eyes. Mama said C was like the moon. It was the most Maribeth had heard her speak. Jonas turned from the stove, his expression unreadable. The moment stretched thin, fragile as spun glass. Your mama was right, Maribeth said carefully. C is exactly like a crescent moon, and L is like a boot, standing tall. Callie considered this, then bent back to her slate with renewed purpose. Jonas returned to the stove, but Maribeth caught the slight relaxation in his shoulders. They sat in companionable silence while Callie worked and the coffee cooled. The house revealed itself in small details, a woman's shawl still draped over one chair, dried flowers in a vase on the windowsill, needlework half finished in a basket by the hearth. Ruth Reddick's presence lingered in every corner, a ghost made of everyday objects. You don't have to keep coming, Jonas said suddenly, quietly enough that Callie wouldn't hear. We manage well enough on our own. Maribeth met his gray eyes steadily. I know what it's like to manage, to tell yourself you're fine alone, to make the silence seem like a choice. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He looked away, out the window toward the white expanse beyond. Callie hasn't spoken to anyone outside this house since her mother passed. Even in town, she goes mute. The doctor said it would pass, but he shrugged. a gesture of helplessness that seemed foreign to his large frame. "Grief takes its own time," Maribeth said. "We can't hurry it along, much as we might wish to." He studied her then, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. "You lost someone." Not a question. He could see it, she supposed, the way those who'd known deep loss could always recognize it in others, like a mark invisible to the fortunate, clear as day to the initiated. "My husband, 2 years ago, mining accident." "I'm sorry." Simple words, but genuine. Not the elaborate sympathy she'd grown tired of in town, the performances of concern that required her to comfort the comforters. Just acknowledgement. One mourner to another. Callie made a small sound of frustration. Her chalk had broken, the pieces too small for her fingers to grip properly. Before Maribeth could react, Jonas was there, kneeling beside his daughter's chair, his large hands gentle as he showed her how to hold the fragment differently. "See, like this. Sometimes when things break, we just have to hold them a new way." The child nodded solemnly, returning to her letters with fierce concentration. Jonas stayed crouched beside her a moment longer, one hand resting lightly on her thin shoulder, and Maribeth saw it clearly, the weight of being both mother and father, the terrible tenderness of a man trying to be soft enough for a broken child, while his own heart was sharp with grief. She finished her coffee, bitter though it was, and prepared to take her leave, but as she reached for her basket, she noticed something. One of Callie's sleeves was unraveling at the cuff, threads pulling loose. "That needs mending," she said, pointing. "The sleeve. It'll only get worse if left." Jonas looked where she indicated, sighed. "Everything wears faster than I can keep up with. I can patch a fence, fix a wagon wheel, but thread and needle." He held up his hands, helpless. "I could show you," Maribeth offered without thinking. "The basic stitches, at least for the simple repairs." "I couldn't ask." "You're not asking. I'm offering." She pulled needle and thread from her basket, settled back in her chair. "Callie, may I borrow your sleeve for a moment?" The girl extended her arm trustingly, and Maribeth began to work, narrating each movement. "See in and out, keeping the stitches small and even. The trick is not to pull too tight, or the fabric will pucker." Jonas leaned closer, genuinely trying to follow. His nearness brought the scent of wood shavings and coffee, the warmth of another human in the cold morning. Maribeth kept her hands steady, her voice level, acting as if teaching a widower to sew was the most natural thing in the world. "Now you try," she said, handing him the needle. His fingers were too large, too used to rougher work. The first stitch went crooked, the second too loose. Callie giggled, actually giggled at the face her father made, and the sound seemed to surprise them all. "Perhaps," Jonas said ruefully, examining his poor attempt. "Some skills are better left to those who possess them." "Practice makes perfect," Maribeth said, but she was smiling. "Though perhaps start with something less dear than Callie's sleeve." She finished the repair herself. Quick, neat stitches that would hold through whatever adventures a 6-year-old might find. When she looked up, both father and daughter were watching her with expressions so similar it made her chest tight. "Next time," Callie said suddenly, "will you teach me?" Next time. The assumption of it. The hope hidden in those two small words caught Maribeth off guard. She looked at Jonas, seeking permission or denial, but found only a careful neutrality in his face. "If your father agrees," she said finally, "and if you promise to be patient, learning to sew takes time." "I'm good at being patient," Callie said solemnly. "Daddy says I'm the most patient girl in Colorado." "That's high praise indeed," Maribeth agreed, packing away her supplies. This time when she stood to leave, it felt less like escape and more like reluctance. Jonas walked her to the door, Callie trailing behind, still clutching her repaired sleeve. On the threshold, he stopped her with a hand that didn't quite touch her arm. "Thursday mornings," he said quietly. "We go to the creek for water then. The house is quiet." An invitation and a warning wrapped together. Maribeth understood he was offering her a time to come when her presence would be less of an intrusion, when Callie wouldn't be there to see a strange woman in her mother's house. It was consideration and self-protection at once. "I have plenty of mending to keep me busy," she said, matching his tone. "But thank you for the coffee." She was halfway down the path when Callie's voice carried after her, small but clear. "Goodbye, Mrs. Cole." Maribeth turned, waved, saw the child pressed against the window, one small hand flat against the glass. Jonas stood behind her, a dark shape in the doorway, watching. The walk home seemed both longer and shorter than before. Longer because her mind kept turning over every word, every glance, every small revelation. Shorter because she was already planning when she might return not Thursday. That was clearly not what Jonas wanted. But perhaps Saturday. Perhaps with more peppermint. Or some of the cookies she used to bake for Samuel. The sun was high when she reached her own door. The morning gone without her noticing. Inside, her house waited quiet, orderly, exactly as she'd left it. No chalk on the table, no broken pieces to navigate, no ghosts but her own. She unpacked her basket slowly, fingers lingering on the thread she'd used to mend Callie's sleeve. Such a small thing, a few stitches to stop unraveling. But sometimes the smallest repairs mattered most. Sometimes they were what kept everything from coming apart entirely. That night, as she worked by lamplight on the parson's wife's endless lace, Maribeth found herself thinking about broken chalk and patient girls, about coffee too bitter to enjoy but too precious to refuse, about a man learning that some things required a gentler touch than he possessed. She thought, too, about next time that presumptuous, hopeful phrase that suggested a future beyond managing, beyond mere endurance. It had been so long since she'd thought in terms of next time, of plans that extended past the next day's mending. Outside, wind rattled the windows, bringing the promise of more snow. Maribeth added wood to the fire, returned to her work, somewhere beyond the ridge. She knew. Another fire burned. Another evening settled over the grieving. But perhaps tomorrow, or the day after, there would be giggling over crooked stitches. Perhaps there would be small hands learning patient work, and coffee shared in companionable silence, and the slow, careful mending of things that couldn't be fixed with thread alone. The wind died down, leaving only the soft whisper of falling snow. Maribeth worked on through the evening, her stitches sure and steady, thinking of all the things that needed mending in this world, and how sometimes the best repairs were the ones you never saw coming. Saturday came with a light snowfall that softened the edges of everything, making the world look like one of those snow globes Samuel had brought her from Denver. Maribeth packed her basket with deliberate care needles, thread, fabric scraps, and wrapped in clean muslin. A dozen molasses cookies she'd baked that morning. The house had filled with their sweet scent, reminding her of happier times when she'd had reason to bake for more than herself. The path to the Reddick house was becoming familiar now, her feet finding their way without conscious thought. She noticed things she'd missed before, the way the pines grew thicker near the creek, how ice formed delicate patterns where water splashed against the rocks, the tracks of deer crossing toward the southern meadows. This awareness of detail meant something, though she wasn't ready to examine what. When she knocked at the red door, it opened more quickly than before. Jonas stood there in a clean shirt, his hair recently trimmed, though still wanting a proper barber's attention. He nodded his greeting and stepped aside, and she entered to find Callie already at the table, a piece of plain fabric spread before her. "Mrs. Cole?" The child's face brightened. "Papa said you might come today. I've been practicing holding the needle like you showed him." Indeed, there were several crooked lines of stitching across the fabric, evidence of determined effort. Maribeth examined them with appropriate seriousness, noting the improvement from beginning to end. "These are very good for first attempts," she said, settling into what was beginning to feel like her chair. See how your stitches got more even as you went along? That shows you're learning. Callie beamed, a smile that transformed her solemn face into something altogether different. Jonas moved about the kitchen, and Maribeth noticed he'd already set out 3 cups, the blue-flowered one for her again. "Coffee?" he asked, though he was already pouring. "Thank you." She accepted the cup, noted it was less bitter than last time. He'd been practicing more than mending. It seemed... "I brought cookies, molasses, if that's acceptable." "Cookies," Callie breathed the word like a prayer. At her father's nod, she carefully unwrapped the bundle, eyes wide at the bounty within. "May I have one now?" "After your lesson," Jonas said firmly, though his eyes held warmth. "Work before treats." They settled into the morning's rhythm, Maribeth showing Callie how to hold the needle properly, how to push it through fabric without pricking her fingers, how to keep her stitches small and even. Jonas worked at the other end of the table, oiling leather tack, but his attention never strayed far from his daughter. "Mama used to sew," Callie said suddenly, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "She made my doll's dress. See?" She fetched the doll from her bed in the corner, displayed its carefully crafted clothing. "She said someday she'd teach me to make dresses too." The silence that followed was complete, even the fire seeming to hold its breath. Jonas's hand stilled on the leather, his jaw tight. Maribeth kept her voice gentle, matter of fact. "Your mama did beautiful work. Look at these tiny stitches like fairy steps across the fabric. She would be proud to see you learning." Callie studied the doll's dress with new eyes, tracing the delicate embroidery with one small finger. "Fairy steps," she repeated softly. "I want to make fairy steps too." "Then we'll practice until you can," Maribeth promised. "But first, let's master giant steps. Even fairies had to start somewhere." The tension eased, Jonas returning to his work, Callie to her stitching. They worked in companionable quiet, broken only by occasional instruction and the child's questions. The cookies waited patiently on the table, their sweet scent mixing with wood smoke and leather oil. "There," Callie announced after a time, holding up her fabric. "I made a whole line without any blood." "Without any..." Maribeth glanced at Jonas, who looked sheepish. "Last week's attempt didn't go as well," he admitted. "We learned that needles are sharper than they look." "And that crying doesn't help the stitches," Callie added solemnly. "But Papa kissed it better and we tried again." The image of Jonas tending to his daughter's pricked finger, encouraging her to continue despite the small hurt, settled warm in Maribeth's chest. She'd seen too many fathers who considered such gentle ministrations women's work entirely. "Well then, I'd say you've earned your cookie," she declared, and Callie dove for the bundle with enthusiasm. They took their break then, cookies and coffee around the table like any ordinary family on a Saturday morning. Except they weren't a family, Maribeth reminded herself. She was a widow teaching a motherless child to sew. Nothing more. The warmth she felt was simple human kindness, the satisfaction of being useful again. "These are wonderful," Jonas said, finishing his second cookie. "Been a long time since we had anything baked fresh. I can manage beans and biscuits, but anything requiring more finesse." "Papa burned the cake," Callie confided through cookie crumbs. "For my birthday. It was black on the outside and soup in the middle." "It was not soup," Jonas protested mildly. "Merely underdone." "You had to eat it with a spoon," Callie giggled, and the sound filled the small house like spring water. Maribeth found herself smiling, then laughing outright as Jonas demonstrated the face he'd made attempting to consume his failed cake. For a moment, just a moment, the house felt less haunted, less careful, like a place where laughter lived alongside sorrow, where joy might grow again given time. The lesson resumed after cookies. Callie applying herself with renewed determination. Her stitches grew steadier, more confident. when she completed an entire line without wavering. She looked up with such pride that Maribeth felt her throat tighten. "Perfect fairy steps," she pronounced. "Your mama would be so pleased." This time, the mention of Ruth didn't freeze the room. Callie smiled. Jonas nodded, and they moved forward together into the next line of stitches. As morning stretched toward noon, Maribeth became aware of how natural this felt, the three of them around the table, each at their own task but bound by invisible threads of companionship. Dangerous thinking. She knew. She'd built a life on being alone, on needing no one. This was temporary, just until... Until what? Until Callie learned to sew, until Jonas found another wife, someone younger, without her burden of grief, until the town's whispers grew too loud to ignore. "You're quiet," Jonas observed, not looking up from his work. "Thinking about all the mending waiting at home?" She lied smoothly. "Mrs. Henderson has torn another dress. I swear that woman attracts damage like flowers draw bees." "You could bring it here," Callie suggested innocently. "We could all sew together." Jonas shot his daughter a look Maribeth couldn't interpret. "Mrs. Cole has her own work to attend to. Callie, we can't monopolize her time." "Of course," Maribeth agreed, though something in her chest twisted at his quick correction. "Though teaching is pleasant work, Callie's a quick learner. She gets that from her mother," Jonas said quietly. "Ruth could learn anything from a book, turn her hand to any skill. She read everything she could find about this land before we came west, determined to be ready for whatever we faced." "Was she?" Maribeth asked gently. "Ready?" Jonas considered this, his hands still on the leather. "She thought she was. We both did. But how do you prepare for isolation? For winters that last forever? For the nearest doctor being 2 days' ride away? She was city-raised, used to society, to conversation. Out here," he gestured toward the window, "the endless white beyond. Out here got into her bones eventually. Made her take chances she shouldn't have." The weight of those words settled over them. Maribeth understood suddenly that the blizzard hadn't been the only thing that killed Ruth Reddick. It had merely been the final chapter in a longer story of loneliness and desperate choices. "It wasn't your fault," she said, "because someone needed to say it." Jonas looked up sharply, his gray eyes dark with old pain. "Wasn't it I brought her here? I promised her a good life, a fresh start. I said I'd keep her safe." "You loved her. That's not the same as being able to control the world." The words came from her own hard-won understanding. How many nights had she blamed herself for not keeping Samuel from the mines that day? For not sensing danger? For not being enough to make him stay home? Jonas held her gaze for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then Callie tugged at her sleeve, requiring help with a knot, and the moment passed. They worked until the sun reached its zenith, filtered through windows that needed washing. Maribeth packed her supplies, leaving the fabric and a needle for Callie to practice with. "Same time next week?" the child asked hopefully. Maribeth glanced at Jonas, found him watching her with an unreadable expression. "If your father agrees." "Saturday mornings suit well enough," he said carefully. "If you can spare the time." "I can." At the door, Jonas stopped her with words this time. "Thank you for what you said about fault. It's only what I've learned myself. Blame is a heavy coat that keeps out nothing but hope." He absorbed this, nodded slowly. "Will you be warm enough walking back weather's turning?" She assured him she would be fine, had walked in worse weather, knew the path well now. All true, yet she was touched by the concern. When had someone last worried about her comfort, her safety? Callie waved from the window as before, but this time Jonas remained in the doorway, watching until the trees swallowed her from view. The weight of his gaze followed her home, a sensation not entirely unwelcome. That evening, as Maribeth sat with the eternal mending, she found herself humming some half-remembered tune from years past. The sound surprised her in the quiet house. She couldn't recall the last time she'd hummed, The last time music had risen unbidden from her throat. Change was coming. Slow as spring, but just as inevitable. She could feel it in the way her hands moved over fabric, in the empty cookie plate that had held a dozen this morning, in the knowledge that next Saturday would find her walking north again, carrying sweetness to a house that needed it. The needle flashed in the lamplight. Fairy steps across damaged cloth, making whole what had been torn. Outside, snow began to fall again, but Maribeth felt warm for the first time in memory. Not from the fire, not from her shawl, but from something harder to name and impossible to mend if it tore. Hope, perhaps, or merely the promise of coffee in a blue-flowered cup and a child's laughter over burned cake. Sometimes the smallest threads held the strongest seams. She worked on through the evening, humming her forgotten tune, thinking of gray eyes and careful words, of fault and forgiveness, of all the ways a heart might learn to beat again after it had forgotten how. The following Saturday arrived with a break in the weather. Weak sunshine filtering through clouds that promised more snow before day's end. Maribeth had spent the week in a peculiar state of anticipation, catching herself watching the clock, calculating hours until she could reasonably return to the house beyond the ridge. Such foolishness at her age, she told herself. Yet still she baked fresh bread that morning, wrapped it warm in clean cloth. When Jonas opened the door, she noticed immediately that something was different. The table was set for 3. Proper china plates instead of the usual tin. A tablecloth that showed careful pressing. Callie stood beside her father in a dress that had been recently washed and mended not by Maribeth's hand. "We thought," Jonas began, then stopped, cleared his throat. "That is, Callie suggested that since you've been so kind with your lessons, we might share a proper meal." "I helped make it," Callie announced proudly. "Papa let me stir the stew and I didn't spill any... much." The domesticity of it caught Maribeth off guard. She'd grown accustomed to their informal arrangements, coffee and cookies, work and conversation. This felt different, weighted with intention she wasn't sure how to interpret. "That's very thoughtful," she managed, setting her basket on the familiar chair. "I brought bread." "Fresh bread," Callie breathed, as if it were gold rather than simple flour and yeast. "We haven't had fresh bread since..." The sentence died, but they all knew the ending. Since Ruth, since before, since when this house held a woman who baked bread as naturally as breathing. They moved through the ritual of preparing the meal with careful choreography, each finding their place in the small space. Maribeth sliced her bread while Jonas ladled stew into bowls, Callie setting spoons with concentrated precision. It felt both strange and familiar, like trying on clothes that almost fit. When they sat, Jonas hesitated before speaking. "We don't, that is, we used to say grace before." "Mama always said the words," Callie added quietly. "Papa doesn't know them, right?" Jonas's jaw tightened, but Maribeth spoke before he could respond. "Perhaps we could simply be grateful in our hearts. Words aren't always necessary." They bowed their heads in silence, each with their own thoughts. Maribeth found herself grateful for more than food, for small hands learning patient stitches, for coffee growing less bitter with practice, for the peculiar comfort of being needed again. The stew was simple but good, hearty with winter vegetables and venison. They ate quietly at first, the formality of the setting creating constraint. Then Callie knocked over her water glass, reaching for bread, and in the flurry of mopping up, the tension broke. "This is why we use tin plates," Jonas said ruefully, wringing water from the tablecloth. "Less worry about breaking things." "But the pretty plates make it special," Callie insisted, clutching her rescued bowl. "Like when Mama..." She stopped, face crumpling. Jonas reached for her, but she pulled away, slipping from her chair and disappearing into the corner where her bed sat. "I'm sorry," Jonas said quietly. "She's been doing better, but sometimes..." "There's no timeline for grief," Maribeth said, watching the small figure curled on the narrow bed. "It comes in waves. Just when you think you're steady, something knocks you over again." Speaking from experience. 2 years of it. She met his eyes steadily. "I still set out Samuel's coffee cup some mornings, still save the newspaper to read aloud to him in the evening. Then I remember." Jonas studied his hands, work-worn and careful. "I light the lantern for her every night, the one she always kept in the window so she could find her way home in the dark. Foolishness. But not foolish." Maribeth rose, began clearing plates with practiced efficiency. "We do what we must to survive the losing." He joined her at the wash basin, their movements finding easy rhythm, she washing, he drying, working in companionable silence while Callie's quiet sniffles gradually stilled. The domestic simplicity of it struck Maribeth anew. When had she last washed dishes with another person? When had such a simple task felt like connection? "She had a laugh like bells," Jonas said suddenly, not looking at her. "Ruth. First time I heard it, in her father's store in Kansas City. I knew I'd do anything to hear it again. Told her I'd build her a palace out west, give her a life of adventure." His laugh was bitter. "Some palace, some adventure." Maribeth's hand stilled in the soapy water. "You gave her love. That's not nothing." "Love doesn't keep you warm when the wood runs low. Doesn't ease the loneliness when your nearest neighbor is a day's ride away. Doesn't stop you from doing foolish things when cabin fever sets in and you just need to see something, anything, besides the same four walls." The pain in his voice was raw, fresh as the day it happened. Maribeth dried her hands slowly, choosing her words with care. "Samuel loved the mines," she said quietly. "Loved the darkness, the danger, the possibility of striking it rich. I begged him to find other work, safer work, but he said the mines were in his blood, that he couldn't breathe properly above ground." She folded the dish towel precisely, smoothing each crease. "The day of the cave-in, I was angry. We'd argued that morning about money, about children we didn't have, about dreams that seemed to get further away with each passing year. My last words to him were sharp ones." Jonas turned to look at her fully then, his gray eyes understanding too much. "Maribeth. The point is," she continued firmly, "we can't love someone out of being who they are. Ruth was city-raised, you said, but she chose to come west with you. That was her choice, her adventure. That it ended badly doesn't erase the choosing." From the corner came a small voice. "Mama said the snow was like diamonds." They turned to find Callie sitting up, face blotchy but calm. She clutched her doll, speaking to it more than them. "She said the mountains were God's cathedral and the wind was the choir. She said she'd never seen anything so beautiful as sunrise on fresh snow." Jonas crossed to his daughter, knelt beside her bed. "She did say that. Didn't she always finding beauty where I just saw cold?" "She said you were her mountain," Callie whispered, leaning into her father's embrace. "Strong and steady and always there." Maribeth turned away from the private moment, busying herself with putting away the dried dishes. But she could hear Jonas's rough breathing, the quiet words he murmured to his daughter, the gradual easing of old pain shared. When they rejoined her, Callie's hand firmly in her father's, the child's chin was set with determination. "I want to show Mrs. Cole Mama's sewing box." Jonas hesitated, but Callie tugged insistently. "Please, Papa, she should see the pretty things." They climbed narrow stairs to a loft space Maribeth hadn't known existed. Under the eaves sat a trunk, cedar by the smell, brass corners gone green with age. Jonas opened it with reverent hands, revealing layers of carefully preserved fabric, lace, ribbon. "Ruth's dowry trunk," he explained unnecessarily. "She brought it from Kansas City." Callie dove in with abandon, pulling out treasures a half-finished sampler, spools of silk thread in jewel colors, patterns cut from ladies' magazines. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a christening gown of such delicate beauty that Maribeth's breath caught. for the baby that never came. Jonas said quietly, "She worked on it for months, said it would be for our son, or daughter. Didn't matter which. The unborn ghosts in the room were almost visible, the children Ruth had dreamed of. The family that had never quite managed to be." Maribeth touched the tiny stitches, each one a hope made tangible. "It's beautiful work," she said simply. "Museum quality. She was an artist." "She was lonely," Jonas corrected. "So lonely she'd sew for children who didn't exist rather than face another empty day." "Papa," Callie protested, but he shook his head. "It's time we spoke truth in this house. Your mama was a wonderful woman who loved us both. But she wasn't happy here. Not truly, and pretending otherwise doesn't honor her memory." The child considered this with solemn eyes, then turned to Maribeth. "Were you happy with your husband?" The directness of children. Maribeth sat on the floor beside the trunk, choosing honesty. "Sometimes, not always. Marriage is complicated. Callie, you can love someone and still feel lonely. You can be grateful for what you have and still want more. Your parents loved each other. That's what matters." Callie seemed satisfied with this. Returning to her exploration of the trunk, she pulled out a packet of letters tied with ribbon, handed them to her father. "Mama's letters from grandmother." Jonas held them like they might burn, then deliberately placed them back in the trunk. Another time, perhaps. They descended the stairs in thoughtful silence. The afternoon had grown long, shadows stretching across the floor. Maribeth knew she should leave, but something held her, the weight of shared confidences, perhaps, or the way Callie had taken her hand on the narrow stairs. "Coffee," Jonas offered, already moving toward the stove. They resumed their usual places, but everything felt different now. The ghost of Ruth Reddick sat more easily among them, acknowledged rather than avoided. Callie pulled out her practice cloth, showing off the progress she'd made during the week. "Look, fairy steps almost as tiny as Mama's." "Getting there," Maribeth agreed, examining the improving stitches. "Practice makes." "Perfect," Callie finished triumphantly. "That's what Mama always said too." Jonas met Maribeth's eyes over his daughter's head, something like wonder in his expression, that his daughter could speak of her mother with joy rather than only pain. It was a gift neither had expected. They passed the remaining hour in quiet industry, Callie sewing, Jonas reading aloud from a book of frontier tales, Maribeth mending a shirt she'd brought along. The domestic scene was so normal it ached. So precisely what she'd once dreamed of that she had to remind herself it was borrowed, temporary. When she prepared to leave, Jonas walked her to the door as had become his custom, but this time he stepped outside with her, into the cold clarity of approaching evening. "Thank you," he said simply, "for letting her remember the good along with the bad. I've been so afraid of the pain I forgot there was joy too." "Grief's like that," Maribeth said, wrapping her shawl tighter. "It colors everything dark until you forget there was ever light. But the light was real. It deserves remembering." He studied her face in the fading day, seeing her perhaps truly for the first time, not just the widow who mended clothes, not just the woman teaching his daughter to sew, but someone who'd walked his same dark path and found a way through. "Maribeth," he said, her name careful on his tongue. "Would you, that is, we would be honored if you'd join us for Christmas dinner. It's still 2 weeks off, but Callie's already making plans." Christmas. She'd planned to spend it as she had the last two, alone with her memories and a small meal she'd barely taste. The invitation hung between them, heavy with possibility. "I'd like that," she heard herself say, "very much." Something eased in his face, tension she hadn't realized he carried. "Good, that's good." She left him standing in his doorway, yellow lamplight spilling around his silhouette. The walk home seemed full of promise, the coming snow more blessing than threat. In her pocket, she carried a small square of lace Callie had insisted she take to remember Mama's pretty things. The child had said, That night, Maribeth lifted her own trunk from beneath the bed, opened it for the first time in months. Samuel's things lay within his good shirt, the watch his father had given him, the letters he'd written during their courtship. She touched each item gently, then added Callie's square of lace to the collection. The past and present mingling, she thought, the dead and living finding their places together. Perhaps that's all any of them could do, carry their ghosts gently while still making room for whatever grace might come. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the path between two houses with fresh white. By morning it would be unmarked again, waiting for new tracks to write their story across the pristine surface. Maribeth closed the trunk carefully and prepared for bed, thinking of shared meals and careful revelations, of fairy steps and mountain men, of the peculiar alchemy that could transform sorrow into something almost like hope. Christmas was coming. For the first time in years, that felt like a promise rather than a threat. The week before Christmas brought a blizzard that sealed Dove Hollow from the outside world. Maribeth watched from her window as the snow piled higher, erasing familiar landmarks, turning the landscape into something foreign and wild. She'd prepared for such weather, wood stacked high, pantry full, but still felt the isolation settling into her bones. 3 days into the storm, she heard the pounding at her door. Jonas stood there, snow-covered and breathing hard, his face tight with worry. "Callie's ill," he said without preamble. "Fever came on sudden. I need—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do." Maribeth was already reaching for her coat, packing a basket with feverfew tea, willow bark, clean cloths. "How high?" "Burning hot. She keeps calling for—" He couldn't finish, but Maribeth knew. Children always called for their mothers when fever took them. The journey to his house was treacherous. Jonas breaking trail while Maribeth struggled to keep pace. The wind howled around them, driving snow like needles against exposed skin. By the time they reached the red door, both were gasping, frozen nearly solid. Inside, the house was stifling hot. Fire built up too high in panic. Callie lay in her small bed, cheeks flushed scarlet, hair damp with sweat. Her eyes were bright but unfocused, seeing things that weren't there. "Mama," she whispered, reaching for Maribeth. "You came back." Jonas made a sound like breaking, but Maribeth took the child's hot hand without hesitation. "I'm here, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." She sent Jonas for snow to cool the washing water, then set about the familiar rituals of tending fever. Strip away the heavy blankets despite his protests. Cool cloths on forehead and wrists. Spoonfuls of tepid tea coaxed between cracked lips. She'd done this before. For neighbor children. For Samuel during his bout with lung fever their first winter. "She needs the doctor," Jonas said, pacing the small space like a caged bear. "Doctor can't come in this weather, even if we could reach him." Maribeth kept her voice calm, soothing. "Fever's not uncommon in children. We keep her cool, keep her drinking, wait for it to break." "That's what I told Ruth," he said harshly. "When she wanted to go out in the storm, wait for it to break. But she said Callie needed medicine. Said she knew the way to town well enough. I should have gone myself. Should have—" "Stop!" Maribeth looked up from her patient. "This isn't that night. I'm here. We'll manage together." The hours blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of cooling cloths and coaxing sips of tea. Jonas tended the fire under her direction, keeping it low despite his instinct to build it higher. They worked in tandem, wordless communication born of shared purpose. Callie drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes calling for her mother, sometimes lucid enough to recognize Maribeth. During one clear moment, she gripped Maribeth's hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Papa needs you." Maribeth glanced at Jonas, found him staring at his daughter with naked fear. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, not sure which of them she was reassuring. Night deepened, the storm showing no signs of abating. Jonas pulled a chair close to the bed, keeping vigil while Maribeth dozed fitfully in the rocker. She woke to find him lighting the lantern in the window, the one he'd told her about. "Old habit," he said quietly when he noticed her watching. "Ruth always said light would guide the lost ones home." "Maybe it will," Maribeth said, too tired for anything but truth. "Maybe she's watching over Callie right now, grateful someone's here to help." He set the lantern carefully on its hook. "Do you believe that the dead watch over us?" "I believe love doesn't die with the body," she said slowly. "Samuel's been gone 2 years, but sometimes I still feel him in the creak of a floorboard. The scent of pipe tobacco when no one's smoking. The way certain sunsets look exactly like his smile." She touched Callie's forehead, found it slightly cooler. "If that's not watching over, I don't know what is." Jonas moved to the window, staring out at the swirling white. "I've been so angry with her, for leaving, for taking that risk, for choosing the storm over staying safe, but maybe—" He pressed his hand against the cold glass. "Maybe she knew something I didn't. Maybe she knew you'd come." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to examine. Maribeth focused on Callie, checking her temperature again, adjusting the cool cloth. The child's breathing had eased, the frightening rasp smoothing into normal sleep sounds. "Fever's breaking," she said quietly. "She'll likely sleep through till morning now." The relief on Jonas's face was almost painful to witness. He sagged into his chair, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. Without thinking, Maribeth reached out, laid her hand on his shoulder. He tensed, then slowly relaxed under her touch. "Thank you," he said roughly. "I couldn't have if I'd been alone." "But you weren't alone." She kept her hand steady, feeling the warmth of him through worn flannel. "And you won't be, as long as you want company." He looked up at her then, gray eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, something that made her breath catch. But before either could speak, Callie stirred, mumbling in her sleep. The moment dissolved, leaving only 2 tired adults tending a sick child. Dawn came pale and hesitant, the storm finally wearing itself out. Callie woke clear-eyed and hungry. The crisis passed as suddenly as it had come. She seemed unsurprised to find Maribeth there, accepting her presence with the easy adaptability of children. "Did I miss Christmas?" was her first coherent question. "Still 3 days away," Jonas assured her, weak with relief. "Plenty of time to get well." They breakfasted together on simple porridge. Callie, managing a few bites before sleep, claimed her again. Natural sleep this time, healing and deep. Maribeth knew she should leave, return to her own house now that the danger had passed. But something held her fatigue, perhaps, or the way Jonas looked at her like she might disappear if he blinked. "Stay," he said quietly. "Just until she wakes again, please." So she stayed, helping him restore order to the chaos of a sick room. They worked quietly, efficiently, and she found herself noting the ways his house had changed since her first visit. New curtains at the windows, store-bought but carefully hung. Books rearranged on their shelf. Spines facing out properly. Small touches that spoke of a man trying to make a home rather than just survive in a house. "You've been busy," she observed, straightening the quilt on Callie's bed. "Trying to make things better, more like they were when—" He stopped, shook his head. "No, that's not right. Not like they were different, maybe good different." "Change isn't betrayal," Maribeth said softly. "It's just life moving forward." He studied her face, seeing the truth of that written in her own small transformations, the way she moved so naturally in his space, the absence of the deep mourning dress she'd worn that first day, the ease with which she'd taken charge in crisis. "Maribeth," he began, then stopped, running his hand through already disheveled hair. "I need to say something, and I'm likely to muddle it, but—" "Papa," Callie's voice, small but clear. "I'm thirsty." The interruption was both frustration and relief. Jonas fetched water while Maribeth helped Callie sit up, propping pillows behind her. The child drank deeply, color returning to her pale cheeks. "You stayed," she said to Maribeth, wonder in her voice. "Even though I was sick?" "Of course I stayed. Friends don't leave when things get difficult." "Are we friends?" Callie asked, with that devastating directness children possessed. Maribeth glanced at Jonas, found him watching intently. "I'd like to think so, if that's acceptable to you both." "More than acceptable," Jonas said roughly. "Callie, Mrs. Cole, Maribeth likely saved your life last night." The child considered this gravely, then announced, "Then she should stay for Christmas and forever. We have room." "Callie," Jonas began, face flushing. But Maribeth actually laughed, the sound surprising them all. "One thing at a time, sweetheart. Let's start with Christmas and see what comes after." The promise of it, the gentle acknowledgement that there would be an after, settled over the room like benediction. Jonas's expression softened, tension leaving his shoulders. Even the house seemed to exhale, shadows retreating as morning sun finally broke through the clouds. Maribeth stayed until afternoon, making sure Callie kept down broth and continued to improve. When she finally prepared to leave, Jonas walked her out as always, but this time he caught her hand at the threshold. "I did muddle it, what I wanted to say earlier." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, work rough but gentle. But Callie had the right of it. "We do have room. When you're ready, if you ever are." She looked up at him, this careful man who lit lanterns for the dead and kept vigil through dark nights, who was learning that hearts could hold more than one love without diminishing either. "I'm not Ruth," she said quietly. "I can't be what she was." "I'm not asking you to be." He released her hand slowly, reluctantly. "I'm asking you to be Maribeth. That's more than enough." She left then, while her composure held, while the invitation hung crystalline between them. The path home was easier, the storm having spent its fury, leaving behind a world transformed but not destroyed. Her house waited, empty and quiet, but somehow less lonely than before. That night, she saw it, a lantern burning in an upstairs window of the house beyond the ridge. Not the memorial light for Ruth, but higher, in what must be Jonas's own room. A new light, hesitant but steady. That seemed to say, "When you're ready, we'll be waiting." Maribeth touched her own window, cold glass warming under her palm. Christmas was coming, bringing with it the promise of shared meals and careful joy. And after that, perhaps, new tracks across fresh snow, leading to a house where there was room for one more at the table. She prepared for bed with movements both old and new, carrying within her the weight of a child's trust and a man's careful hope. Outside, the lantern continued to burn, a small defiance against the dark. Maribeth smiled, thinking of fairy steps and giant leaps, of the courage required for both. 3 days until Christmas. 3 days to decide if she was brave enough to accept what was being offered, not just a place at a table, but a chance to help stitch a new pattern from the torn pieces of 2 broken families. The lantern burned on through the night, steady as a heartbeat, patient as only light could be. Christmas morning dawned bright and bitter cold, the kind of day that made the snow squeak underfoot and breath freeze in white clouds. Maribeth had been awake since before dawn, nervousness making sleep impossible. She'd changed her dress twice, finally settling on the deep blue wool she'd made last month, not morning colors, but not festive either. A careful choice for a careful day. The basket she'd packed sat by the door, apple pie still warm from the oven, preserves from last summer's berries, and wrapped in tissue paper. Gifts she'd labored over for weeks. For Jonas, a new muffler knitted in sturdy gray wool. For Callie, a doll's dress sewn from scraps of the fine fabric in Ruth's trunk, each stitch a prayer for acceptance. The walk to the Reddick house had become so familiar she could have made it with her eyes closed. But today, everything looked different. Ice crystals caught the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Trees wore coats of white velvet, and even her own footprints seemed to lead somewhere new. She was halfway there when she heard the bells, the bright jingling of harness bells cutting through the still air. Around the bend came Jonas, driving a small sleigh she hadn't known he owned. Callie bundled beside him in quilts and scarves until only her bright eyes showed. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Cole," the child called out, voice muffled but joyful. "Papa said we shouldn't make you walk in the cold." Jonas brought the sleigh alongside her, his face carefully neutral but his eyes warm. "Thought you might appreciate a ride." He helped her up, his hand firm and steady, and settled her on the bench beside Callie. The child immediately pressed close, chattering about Christmas preparations, about the goose Jonas had traded for, about the tree they'd cut and decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. "And Papa made something special," Callie confided in a stage whisper. "But it's a secret until after dinner." "Callie," Jonas warned, but his tone was fond rather than stern. The ride was brief but magical. Bells singing their silver song, runners hissing over packed snow. Maribeth found herself laughing at Callie's excitement, at the way Jonas had to steady the horse when a rabbit darted across their path, at the sheer unexpected pleasure of being fetched like someone who mattered. The house, when they arrived, had been transformed. Greenery graced the windows, candles flickered on every surface, and the promised tree stood in the corner, humble but loved. The table was set with the good china again, and something delicious smelling roasted in the oven. "It's beautiful," Maribeth said, meaning it. Callie insisted on using everything festive we could find. Jonas explained, helping her with her coat. "Even things we haven't touched since Mama's last Christmas." Callie finished matter-of-factly. "But she would want us to use them. Pretty things shouldn't hide in trunks forever." The simple wisdom of it struck them all silent for a moment. Then Callie was tugging Maribeth toward the tree, showing off each decoration, explaining who had made what and when. Some were clearly Ruth's work, delicate angels cut from paper, intricate snowflakes that must have taken hours. Others were newer, cruder, bearing the mark of a child's determination and a father's assistance. "This one's my favorite," Callie said, pointing to a lopsided star. "Papa and I made it together. He cut and I pasted, and it doesn't look like much, but it's ours." "It's perfect," Maribeth assured her, and meant it. What was perfection anyway, compared to love made visible? They settled into the day's rhythm, Jonas tending the goose, Maribeth helping with vegetables and gravy, Callie setting and resetting the table in pursuit of some vision only she could see. It felt both strange and right, this domestic dance. How quickly humans could adapt, could find new patterns in the wake of loss. When they finally sat to dinner, the table groaned under the weight of their efforts. Jonas carved with careful precision while Callie recounted every Christmas she could remember, weaving her mother's presence through the stories without pain, just love. "Mama always made sugar cookies shaped like angels," she said, accepting her plate. "Maybe next year we could try Mrs. Cole. Do you know how—" Next year, the assumption of it, the easy inclusion, made Maribeth's throat tight. "I do. My mother taught me when I was about your age." "Then it's settled," Callie declared with a 6-year-old certainty. "Next Christmas, angel cookies." Jonas met Maribeth's eyes over his daughter's head, a question in his gaze. She gave the slightest nod, and something in his shoulders eased. They ate with good appetite, conversation flowing easier than it ever had. Jonas told stories of his own childhood Christmases in Ohio before the wanderlust took him west. Maribeth shared memories of helping her father deliver Christmas baskets to mining families, of her mother's annual battle with fruitcake. Even Callie contributed. though her memories were fewer the Christmas when she got her beloved doll, the year it snowed so hard Papa couldn't open the door. After dinner, they moved to the hearth, full and content. Callie distributed gifts with great ceremony. For her father, a bookmark made of pressed flowers sealed between glass pieces, "For all your reading," she explained. For Maribeth, a handkerchief with embroidered initials, the stitches careful if not quite even. "You've been practicing," Maribeth said, touched beyond words. "Every night," Callie confirmed proudly. "Papa helped when I got stuck." Maribeth's own gifts were received with gratifying enthusiasm. Jonas ran his hand over the muffler repeatedly, as if memorizing the texture. "Haven't had anything this fine since I left home," he said quietly. "Thank you." But it was Callie's reaction to the doll dress that made the day. She held it up to the light, examining every detail, the tiny buttons, the lace collar salvaged from her mother's sewing box, the careful pleats in the skirt. "It's like Mama made it," she breathed. "Only different. Better, because you made it for me." "Now," Jonas said, clearing his throat roughly, "I believe it's my turn." He disappeared upstairs, returning with something wrapped in an old quilt. Setting it carefully before Maribeth, he stepped back, suddenly shy. Inside was a sewing box, crafted from pine and rubbed to a soft glow. The lid bore carved wildflowers, delicate as lace. Inside, compartments for threads and needles, a hidden drawer for scissors, everything a seamstress might need. "Jonas!" Maribeth breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. When did you—" "Been working on it in the barn," he admitted. "Thought you should have something as fine as your work. Something that's yours, not borrowed or make do." She looked up at him, this careful man who spoke in wood and worry, who carved beauty in secret while she slept. "It's the finest thing I've ever owned." "There's something else," Callie announced, bouncing with excitement. "Show her, Papa." Jonas looked momentarily flustered, then reached into his pocket. What he pulled out made Maribeth's breath catch a small silver thimble, engraved with her initials. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She'd have wanted it used, not hidden away," Callie thought. "That is, we thought." "That you should have it," Callie finished firmly. "For all your sewing, for teaching me, for staying when I was sick." Maribeth held the thimble to the light, seeing generations of care in its worn surface. To accept it was to accept so much more, a place in their history, in their future. Her hands trembled slightly as she slipped it onto her finger. "Perfect fit." "Thank you," she said, including them both in her gaze. "I'll treasure it always." The afternoon mellowed into evening, lazy and golden. They played simple games, told riddles, listened to Jonas read from a book of Christmas tales. Callie fell asleep against Maribeth's shoulder, worn out from excitement and too much pie. "I should take her up," Jonas said softly, but made no move to do so. "Let her rest a moment," Maribeth suggested. "She's had a big day." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, snow beginning to fall again outside the windows. The room held them in its warm embrace, complete and whole. "This is the first Christmas since Ruth that felt right," Jonas said eventually. "Not forced or hollow, just right." "Grief changes," Maribeth replied, her hand gentle on Callie's hair. "Doesn't go away, but changes, makes room for other things." "For new things," he agreed, then seemed to gather himself. "Maribeth, I need to ask, what are your intentions?" The directness of it made her smile. "Intentions? Toward us, toward—" he gestured helplessly. Whatever this is becoming." She considered her words carefully, aware of the sleeping child between them, the weight of the moment. "I came here that first day to mend a coat, nothing more, but somewhere between the fairy steps and the bitter coffee, between your daughter's trust and your own careful kindness, I found myself mending more than clothes. And now, she met his steady gaze. Now I find myself thinking of next Christmas, of angel cookies and new traditions, of teaching Callie to embroider, of sharing Sunday dinners, of filling this house with more than memories. She took a breath. If that's welcome, if there's room. There's room, he said roughly. Ruth made this house a home once. You're making it one again. Different but no less precious. We just need to know. Is this what you want? Not what we need, but what you want. She thought of her empty house, of 2 years of silence, of the way she'd rebuilt herself stitch by careful stitch. Then she looked around this room at the child sleeping trustfully against her side, at the man who carved beauty in secret, at the life being offered not as replacement but as continuation. Yes, she said simply, this is what I want. Something shifted in the room, subtle but profound. Jonas reached across the small space between them, covered her hand with his. Not passionate, not demanding, just a quiet claim and promise combined. Then stay, he said. Not just for Christmas, stay. Outside, the lantern in the window burned steady, but its meaning had changed, no longer calling the lost home, but celebrating the found. Callie stirred, mumbling something about angel cookies, and they both smiled. I'll need to fetch my things, Maribeth said practically. Close up my house properly. There are arrangements to make, proprieties to observe. Of course, Jonas agreed. We'll do everything proper, but tonight just be here, be home. Home, the words settled around her like a comfortable shawl. Warm and right. She squeezed his hand, felt him squeeze back, and knew that some gifts couldn't be wrapped, they could only be accepted with grateful hearts and gentle hands. The fire burned low. Snow fell soft outside. And in the house with the red door, 3 people sat together, not replacing what was lost, but building something new from the pieces that remained. It was, Maribeth thought, the finest mending she'd ever done. The week after Christmas brought a thaw that turned the roads to mud and made travel treacherous. Maribeth had returned to her own house to settle affairs. But the separation felt unnatural now, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. She found herself rushing through tasks that had once consumed entire days, eager to return to the house beyond the ridge. It was during one of these hurried visits back to the Reddick home that everything shifted. She'd come to help Callie with a new sewing project, but found the house strangely quiet. Jonas sat at the table, shoulders hunched, a letter spread before him. What's wrong? She asked, setting down her basket. He looked up, gray eyes stormy with something she couldn't read. Letter from Ruth's parents. In Kansas City, they want Callie. The words hung in the air like ice crystals. Maribeth sank into a chair, mind racing. They want, but surely they can't simply... They're her grandparents. They have means, a fine house, good schools. His voice was flat, emotionless in that way that meant too much emotion to release safely. They say a girl needs a woman's influence, needs proper society, needs more than a grieving father can provide. Where's Callie? In the barn with the new kittens. Doesn't know yet. He rubbed his face with both hands. How do I tell her? How do I... Maribeth reached across the table, covered his hands with hers. You don't... Not yet. Let me read the letter. The missive was formal, written in a woman's careful script. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison laid out her case with lawyer-like precision, their comfortable circumstances, the excellent schools for young ladies, the music and art teachers, the society that would ensure Callie grew up refined and accomplished. Between the lines, Maribeth read other things: grief for a lost daughter, fear for a granddaughter growing up motherless in the wilderness, genuine if misguided concern. They're not wrong, Jonas said heavily, about what they can offer. Ruth always worried about Callie growing up rough, without proper education, without the things she had as a girl. Ruth chose this life, Maribeth reminded him. chose you, chose to raise Callie here. And look how that ended. The bitterness in his voice made her heart ache. She moved around the table, stood behind his chair, placed her hands on his shoulders. Jonas, look at me. He turned, face drawn with exhaustion and fear. She knelt beside his chair, bringing them eye to eye. Callie needs more than music lessons and fine dresses. She needs a father who loves her, who teaches her to be strong and kind and brave. She needs the mountains and the snow and the space to grow into whoever she's meant to be. And yes, she needs a woman's influence too, which is why. She stopped, suddenly uncertain. They'd spoken of her staying, but not of formal arrangements, not of what she would be to Callie in the eyes of the law and society. Which is why she has you. Jonas finished softly. Or will have, if. He stood abruptly, paced to the window. This changes things. I can't ask you to take on a legal battle, to deal with Ruth's family, to... You're not asking, I'm offering. She rose, went to stand beside him, through the window. They could see Callie in the barn doorway, cradling a kitten, talking earnestly to it. That child has lost enough. She won't lose her father too, not if I can help it. Jonas turned to her then, something desperate in his expression. They'll want to know who you are, what claim you have, whether there's an understanding between us. Isn't there? She asked quietly. He caught her hand, held it carefully between both of his. Maribeth Cole, I'm no good with pretty words. Never have been, but these past months you've brought light back into this house. You've helped my daughter heal, helped me remember that life goes on even after loss. I know I'm not much of a catch, a widower with a child, a small ranch, ghosts in every corner. But if you'd have us, if you'd consider... Jonas Reddick, she interrupted gently. Are you proposing to me to spite your former in-laws or because you want to... Both, he admitted with a rueful smile. Though I'd have found the courage eventually, letter or no letter. Callie asked me just yesterday when I was going to make things proper, said she was tired of you leaving every evening. Despite everything, Maribeth found herself smiling. 6 years old and already managing your life. She's had to grow up fast. His thumb stroked across her knuckles. Too fast, but with you here, she laughs more, plays more, acts like a child should act. And you, Maribeth asked, what do you act like with me here? Like a man who might have a future instead of just a past. He drew her closer, tentative still. Is that enough? Am I enough? She thought of her empty house, of the careful life she'd built around absence. Then she thought of mornings around the scarred table, of teaching Callie to make fairy steps, of Jonas reading aloud by firelight. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something altogether new. More than enough, she said. He kissed her then, careful and sweet, a promise sealed in the quiet kitchen while snow began to fall again outside. When they drew apart, both were trembling slightly. We should tell Callie, Jonas said, together, then figure out how to respond to the letter. They called her in from the barn, kitten still in her arms. She took one look at their faces, his serious, hers gently smiling, and announced, Finally, I thought you'd never sort it out properly. Callie Rose Reddick, Jonas said, trying for stern and failing. Have you been scheming? Not scheming, hoping. She set the kitten carefully on the floor, came to stand between them. Does this mean Mrs. Cole will stay forever, be my new mama? The word hung in the air, precious and painful. Maribeth knelt to Callie's level. I'd like to stay, if you'll have me, but I won't try to replace your mama. She'll always be your first mother, always be special. I'd just like to be your Maribeth, who loves you and wants to help take care of you. Is that acceptable? Callie considered this with her usual gravity, then threw her arms around Maribeth's neck. More than acceptable. It's perfect. They held each other while Jonas looked on, his expression soft with relief and something deeper. When Callie pulled back, she was all business again. "When will you get married? Can I wear my blue dress? Will we have cake?" "Slow down, little miss." Jonas laughed. "One thing at a time." But Maribeth was already thinking ahead, practical as always. "The letter," she said quietly to Jonas. "We'll need to respond soon." He nodded, understanding. They'd need to present a united front, a stable family unit. "How quickly can we arrange things? I mean, properly, but—" "I'll speak to Reverend Mills tomorrow," she said. "Given the circumstances, I'm sure he'll understand the need for haste." That evening, after Callie had gone to bed clutching her kitten and chattering about wedding plans, Jonas and Maribeth composed their response to the Morrisons. Maribeth's neat script laid out their situation, simply Jonas's dedication as a father, Callie's happiness and health, and the upcoming marriage that would provide the feminine influence they worried about. "Should we invite them to visit?" Maribeth asked, pen hovering. "To see for themselves that Callie is well cared for." Jonas grimaced, but nodded. "Ruth would want them to know their granddaughter, as long as they understand she stays here." They finished the letter, formal but not unfriendly, and sealed it for tomorrow's post. Then they sat by the fire, hands linked, contemplating the speed at which life could change. "Are you certain?" Jonas asked one more time. "This isn't how you imagine things happening, rushed, forced by circumstances. Life rarely happens how we imagine." Maribeth replied, "I imagined growing old with Samuel, having his children, living a different story entirely. But that story ended, and I had to choose stay in the ending or write a new beginning." She squeezed his hand. "I choose the beginning. I choose you and Callie and whatever comes next." He brought their joined hands to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "I'll spend my life trying to be worthy of that choice." "Just be yourself," she said. "That's worthy enough." They sat together until the fire burned low, planning quietly. A simple ceremony. Just them and a few witnesses. Her house to be rented to the new schoolteacher coming in spring. Her things to be moved here, blended with what existed, creating something new from two partial homes. "Will you mind?" Jonas asked. "The ghost of her in every corner." "We all have ghosts," Maribeth said simply. "The trick is learning to live alongside them instead of for them. Besides," she added with a small smile, "this house has been waiting for laughter again. Between Callie and those kittens, I think we can manage that." The next days passed in a blur of arrangements. Reverend Mills, understanding the situation, agreed to perform the ceremony that Sunday after regular services. Mrs. Henderson, the town's chief gossip, was scandalized by the haste until Maribeth quietly explained about the grandparents. "Well then," Mrs. Henderson declared, "we'll just have to show those Kansas City folks what a proper Colorado wedding looks like. I'll organize the ladies. You just show up in something pretty." And so it was that Sunday morning found Maribeth in her best dress, not her wedding dress from years ago, but the blue wool that had marked her first step away from mourning, standing before the altar with Jonas. Callie stood between them in her treasured blue dress, holding a bouquet of paper flowers she'd made herself. The ceremony was simple, the words traditional, but when Jonas slipped a plain gold band on her finger, "It was my mother's," he'd explained. "But if you'd prefer something new." Maribeth felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Mills intoned, and Callie cheered loud enough to echo off the church rafters. The ladies had indeed organized, transforming the church hall into something festive with winter greenery and candles. There was cake properly baked this time and music from the Marshall boys' fiddles, and dancing that went on despite the snow beginning to fall. "No regrets?" Jonas asked as they swayed together, Callie spinning circles around them. "None," Maribeth assured him. "Though I do wonder what your in-laws will think when they receive our letter. They'll think their daughter found a man who loved her, And that man found another good woman to help raise their granddaughter. If they're sensible, they'll see it's for the best. And if they're not sensible, then we'll face that when it comes together. Together. The word that had once meant her and Samuel now meant something different, her and Jonas and Callie. A family built from broken pieces but whole nonetheless. That night, in the house beyond the ridge that was now officially home, Maribeth unpacked her sewing box, Jonas's Christmas gift, and placed it on the shelf next to Ruth's. 2 women's lives, side by side, both part of the story of this family. "Is it strange?" Jonas asked, watching from the doorway. "Being here as my wife instead of a visitor." "Everything about us has been strange," she replied, turning into his arms. "Why should this be different?" He laughed, soft and low. "Fair point, though I hope some things will be different now." She blushed but didn't look away. They were neither of them young, both carrying their share of scars and memories. But there was sweetness in this second chance, in choosing each other with eyes wide open. "Papa Maribeth," Callie's voice carried from her corner of the room. "Will you tuck me in, both of you?" They went together, found her in bed with all 3 kittens despite rules about animals and furniture. "Just for tonight," she bargained. "Because it's special." "Just for tonight," Jonas agreed, sitting on one side of the narrow bed while Maribeth took the other. "Tell me a story," Callie demanded. "About a girl who gets 2 mamas who both love her," Maribeth began, weaving a tale of a lucky princess who was twice blessed, while Jonas added details and Callie corrected them both. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in fresh white, but inside they were warm and whole and home. The lantern in the window burned steady, but its meaning had changed once more. Now it said simply, "Here lives a family." Come morning there would be challenges, letters to receive, grandparents to convince, a life to build from 2 separate pasts. But tonight there was just this 3 people who had found each other across loss and learned that love, like light, could always find a way home. Spring came late that year, winter holding on with stubborn fingers until April. The response from Kansas City had arrived in February, stiff, formal, expressing concern about the hasty marriage and announcing their intention to visit come summer. Jonas had crumpled the letter, but Maribeth smoothed it out, read it again with careful eyes. "They're scared," she said simply. "They lost their daughter and fear losing their granddaughter too." Now, with patches of green finally showing through the melting snow, the reality of that visit loomed. The house had undergone subtle transformations through the winter, Maribeth's touches everywhere, from new curtains at the windows to the garden plot she'd marked out for vegetables. But as she stood in the kitchen, kneading bread for tomorrow's baking, she wondered if it would be enough for city folks' standards. "You're thinking too loud," Jonas said from the doorway. He'd been mending fence all morning, shirt sleeves rolled up despite the cool air. "I can hear it from the barn." "Just wondering what Ruth's mother will think," she admitted. "Whether she'll see a proper home or just wilderness." Jonas crossed to her, placed his hands over hers on the dough. "She'll see Callie happy. That's what matters." Through the window, they could watch the child in question chasing chickens with her usual determination, ribbons flying from her braids. She'd grown 2 inches over the winter, her dresses all needing lengthening. Her laughter carried on the wind, bright as bird song. "She asked me something yesterday," Maribeth said quietly. "Asked if she could call me Mama." Jonas's hands stilled. "What did you say?" "I said I'd be honored, but we should think about it together, all of us." She turned to face him, flour on her hands. "I don't want to erase Ruth, but you're the one teaching her to braid her hair. You're the one she runs to with scraped knees and bad dreams. You're the one showing her how to be a woman in this world." He cupped her face gently. "Ruth would understand. I think she'd be grateful." That evening, they broached the subject at dinner. Callie listened solemnly as they talked about names and memories, about honoring the past while embracing the present. "So I could call you Mama," she said slowly, "but still remember my first Mama too." "Exactly," Maribeth confirmed, "like having two names for different precious things." Callie considered this. "Mama Beth," she decided. "That way it's both you and just you." The simplicity of it, the perfect child logic, made Maribeth's eyes burn. "Mama Beth it is." Jonas reached across the table, took both their hands. "My girls," he said roughly. "How did I get so lucky twice?" The weeks leading to the grandparents' visit passed in a blur of preparation. Maribeth threw herself into making the house shine, though Jonas insisted it was fine as it was. She made new clothes for all of them, prepared preserves and pickles to show her domestic skills, even convinced Jonas to whitewash the fence. "They're not coming to inspect us," he grumbled, paint in his hair. "Aren't they?" She handed him another brush. "We're asking them to trust us with their only grandchild. I'd inspect us too." The morning the stage was due, all three of them dressed in their finest. Callie fidgeted with her collar, nervous for the first time Maribeth had seen. "What if they don't like me?" she whispered. "What if I'm not ladylike enough?" Maribeth knelt, straightened the child's ribbon. "You are exactly as ladylike as you need to be. You're kind, brave, clever, and loved. That's worth more than all the fancy manners in Kansas City." The stage arrived in a cloud of dust and commotion. Two figures emerged, a man in a city suit looking uncomfortable in the western landscape, and a woman whose posture spoke of rigid propriety even before Maribeth could see her face. Adelaide Morrison was smaller than expected, bird-like, with gray hair severely styled and eyes the same shade as Callie's. Those eyes took in everything the simple house. Jonas's work clothes, despite his good shirt, Maribeth's careful appearance, and finally, inevitably, her granddaughter. "Callista," she breathed, and Maribeth saw it, then the grief barely held in check, the desperate love disguised as disapproval. Callie, to her credit, stepped forward and dropped a curtsy she'd been practicing. "Hello, grandmother, grandfather. Welcome to our home." The formality of it seemed to break something in Adelaide. She dropped to her knees, heedless of her fine traveling dress in the dust, and opened her arms. After a moment's hesitation, Callie went into them. They brought the Morrisons inside, served coffee and the cake Maribeth had baked that morning. Conversation was stilted, careful. Theodore Morrison said little, clearly deferring to his wife. Adelaide asked pointed questions about Callie's education, her activities, her health. "She's learning to read from the Bible and McGuffey's Reader," Jonas explained. "Maribeth teaches her sewing and figures. Come fall, she'll attend the new school in town." "The new school?" Adelaide's tone suggested skepticism about rural education. "Yes, ma'am," Maribeth interjected smoothly. "The town hired a teacher from Denver, Miss Patterson. She's very accomplished, speaks 3 languages. This seemed to momentarily satisfy Adelaide, but her sharp eyes continued cataloging everything. When Callie showed off her sewing sampler, Adelaide examined it like a judge at a fair. "Your stitches are improving," she finally allowed. "Your mother had natural talent with a needle." "Mama Beth is teaching me," Callie said proudly. "She says I'll be making whole dresses by Christmas." The casual use of the maternal name made Adelaide's spine stiffen. "Mama Beth." "That's what I call her," Callie explained. "Because she's my mama now, but Beth too, so it's special." Adelaide's gaze turned to Maribeth, and in it was calculation, assessment, and something else, perhaps recognition of another woman who'd known loss. "Perhaps," Adelaide said carefully, "Callista could show her grandfather the barn while Mrs. Reddick and I have tea." Jonas started to protest, but Maribeth touched his hand. "That would be lovely. Callie, why don't you show grandfather your kittens? They're nearly cats now." When the man and child had gone, Adelaide's posture changed, still rigid, but differently so, like armor rather than judgment. "You're not what I expected," she said bluntly. "What did you expect?" Maribeth poured fresh tea with steady hands. "Someone younger, prettier, more obviously after a father for her own children." Adelaide's words were harsh, but her tone held curiosity. "Instead, I find a widow of appropriate age, clearly educated, with good domestic skills and genuine affection for my granddaughter." "I love her," Maribeth said simply, "not because she comes with Jonas, but for herself. She's a remarkable child." "She is," Adelaide's voice cracked slightly. "She's all we have left of Ruth." "No," Maribeth corrected gently. "You have your memories, your love, the parts of Ruth that live on in how Callie laughs and learns and grows. Those aren't lost." Adelaide studied her for a long moment. "You've lost someone too." "My husband, 3 years ago now. So I understand how grief colors everything, makes you want to hold tight to what remains. And yet you're here, making a new family with my daughter's husband." There was accusation in it, but also genuine puzzlement. Maribeth chose her words carefully. "Jonas and we understood each other's grief. We didn't rush into anything. I came to mend a coat, stayed to teach Callie sewing, and slowly we all began healing together. This isn't about replacing what was lost, it's about building something new from what remains." Adelaide sipped her tea, processing. Through the window, they could see Callie leading her grandfather around the yard, chattering constantly while Theodore nodded bemusedly. "She seems happy," Adelaide admitted grudgingly. "She is. Not always. She has sad days, angry days, days when she misses her mother terribly. But yes, mostly happy. Children are resilient when they're loved." "The letters she sends are full of you," Adelaide said. "Mama Beth this, Mama Beth that. It's clear she adores you." "The feeling is mutual." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Adelaide asked, "Do you have her mother's sewing box?" Maribeth rose, retrieved Ruth's box from its shelf. Adelaide opened it with reverent hands, touching the familiar items within. "I gave her this when she married," she said softly. "Told her she'd need it for mending Jonas's work clothes. She laughed, said she'd married him for adventure, not darning socks." Her voice broke. "I should have stopped her, should have kept her safe in Kansas City where she belonged." "She chose her life," Maribeth said gently. "Just as I chose mine. We can't live for our mother's dreams, only our own." Adelaide looked up sharply, then slowly nodded. "Ruth always said that. Said she'd rather have 1 year of real living than 50 of safety." She closed the box carefully. "She got 7 years, 7 years of this wilderness, this man, this life she chose. And she gave us Callista." "Callie," Maribeth corrected gently. "She prefers Callie." "Callie, then—" Adelaide straightened, armor returning. "Very well. I see she's cared for, educated as well as circumstances allow, and loved. That will have to suffice." It wasn't enthusiastic approval, but it was acceptance. When Jonas and Theodore returned with Callie between them, covered in barn dust and beaming, the tension had eased fractionally. The visit lasted 2 more days. Adelaide observed everything: meals, lessons, bedtime routines. She watched Jonas with his daughter, saw the gentle care behind the rough exterior. She watched Maribeth manage the household with quiet efficiency, teaching Callie practical skills while nurturing her imagination. Most of all, she watched Callie herself confident, articulate, clearly thriving. The morning of their departure, Adelaide pulled Maribeth aside. "I still think she'd have opportunities in Kansas City she won't have here. Music, art, proper society." "Perhaps," Maribeth agreed. "But she'd lose the mountains, the freedom, the father who adores her. And when she's older, if she wants those things, we'll make sure she has the choice." Adelaide studied her one last time. "You're a good woman, Maribeth Reddick, Not the woman I'd have chosen for Jonas, but then I chose poorly the first time. Didn't I? Ruth needed someone who understood her wild heart. It seems Callie needs someone who can nurture her gentle one. She pressed something into Maribeth's hand, a cameo brooch, delicate and old. This was my mother's. Ruth wore it at her wedding. It should stay with Callie now, but keep it safe until she's old enough. The stage pulled away in dust and noise. Adelaide waving regally while Theodore looked relieved to be heading back to civilization. Callie stood between Jonas and Maribeth, waving until they were out of sight. "Will they come back?" she asked. "Perhaps," Jonas said. "Or perhaps we'll visit them someday when you're older." "I'd like that," Callie decided. "But I'm glad they're not taking me away. I belong here." That night, as they tucked her in only one kitten on the bed, now house rules slowly prevailing, Callie hugged them both extra tight. "Grandmother said I look like my first mama," she confided. "But she said I smile like you, Mama Beth, like I learned it new." Later, as Jonas and Maribeth sat by their fire, the cameo brooch lay between them on the table, catching the light. She gave her blessing. Jonas marveled. "I never thought Adelaide Morrison doesn't give anything easily." "She loves Callie," Maribeth said simply. "Love makes us do surprising things." He drew her close, pressed a kiss to her temple. "That it does. A year ago, I couldn't imagine ever being happy again. Now look at us." "A family," Maribeth agreed. "Odd and patched together, but solid." "Like a well-mended coat," he teased, and she laughed. Outside, the spring night was full of promise, peeper frogs singing, early flowers blooming, the world renewing itself once more. Inside, a fire crackled, a child slept peacefully, and two people who'd thought their best days were behind them discovered that sometimes life saved its sweetest chapters for last. The lantern in the window burned on, steady as always. But its light seemed warmer now, not calling anyone home, but simply celebrating that everyone was already there. Summer had settled over Colorado like a warm blanket, bringing with it the bustle of having season. Jonas spent long days in the fields with hired hands, coming home dust-covered and exhausted. Maribeth kept busy with the garden, preserving the early vegetables, and managing the household that had grown to feel as natural as breathing. It was on such an afternoon, while she was hanging laundry and Callie was practicing her letters on the porch, that Jonas returned early, his face grave. "There's been a fire," he said without preamble. "At the Hendricks place. Lightning strike. The barn's gone. Half their hay with it." Maribeth's hands stilled on the wet sheet. The Hendricks family had 5 children, the youngest still in arms. Without that hay, their stock wouldn't make it through winter. "We have extra," she said, already thinking practically. "And preserved food. I'll pack a basket." "There's more." Jonas removed his hat, ran his hand through sweat-dampened hair. "Tom Hendricks was in the barn when it caught. He got out, but he didn't need to finish. Burns were serious business out here, far from any doctor." "Callie," Maribeth called, already untying her apron. "Get my sewing basket and the medicine box. We're going visiting." They loaded the wagon quickly. Food, medical supplies, clean cloths for bandages. Callie climbed up without being told, her small face set with determination. She'd learned early that neighbors helped neighbors, that frontier life demanded community. The Hendricks ranch looked like a scene from Maribeth's nightmares. The barn still smoldered, black skeleton beams pointing accusingly at the sky. Children wandered the yard with the lost look of disaster, while Martha Hendricks sat on the porch steps, baby on her hip, staring at nothing. "Martha," Maribeth said gently, climbing down from the wagon. "We've come to help." The woman looked up, eyes red with smoke and tears. "Tom's inside. Won't let me tend him proper. Says it's not fitting for a woman to see." "Men and their pride," Maribeth said briskly. "Jonas, go talk sense to him." Callie and I will start with the children." What followed was organized chaos. Jonas coaxed Tom into accepting help while Maribeth set Martha to directing the children in salvage operations, anything to give her purpose beyond worry. Callie proved invaluable, distracting the younger children with stories while Maribeth examined Tom's burns. They weren't as bad as feared painful. Yes, and requiring careful tending, but not the life-threatening injuries she'd dreaded. She cleaned and dressed them with steady hands, talking Tom through the pain with the same calm voice she'd used for Callie's fever months ago. "You're lucky," she told him firmly. "These will heal clean if you keep them dressed proper and don't play hero. Martha needs you whole, not proud." By evening, some order had been restored. Neighbor families had arrived with more supplies. Men already talking about a barn raising come Saturday. The Frontier Way disaster bringing community together like nothing else could. It was full dark when the Reddicks finally headed home. Callie dozed between them on the wagon seat, exhausted from wrangling children all day. Jonas drove in thoughtful silence while Maribeth watched stars emerge in the clear sky. "You were something today," he said finally. "Taking charge like that, Tom Hendricks isn't an easy man to tend proud as they come." "Pride's a luxury we can't afford out here," Maribeth replied. "He knew it too, underneath the bluster." "Made me think," Jonas continued slowly, "about the night Ruth went for help. If you'd been here then, known what you know." "Don't," she touched his arm. "That way lies madness. We can't change what was, only what is." He nodded, but she could see the thoughts still churning. When they reached home and got Callie tucked into bed, she barely stirred during the transfer. Jonas caught Maribeth's hand before she could retreat to their room. "I need to say something." His voice was rough. "These past months, I've watched you become part of this community, not just as my wife, but as yourself. The women trust you, come to you for advice. The men respect you. And today," he paused, searching for words. In the lamplight, she could see vulnerability in his weathered face. "Today I realized I've been selfish, keeping you here, tied to this small life, when you could be doing so much more. You have healing skills, teaching skills. In a bigger town, you could—" "Jonas Reddick," she interrupted firmly. "Are you trying to send me away?" "No." The word exploded from him. "God, no, I'm trying to say, to ask." He took a breath. "What do you want, Maribeth? Not what Callie needs or what I need. What do you want?" She considered the question seriously, as it deserved. "Today, when I was helping Martha, when I saw those children's faces, when neighbors came together without being asked, I realized something. I spent 2 years after Samuel died just existing, mending clothes because it needed doing, keeping house because that's what was expected. But I wasn't living." She stepped closer, placed her hand over his heart. "Here, with you and Callie, as part of this community, I'm living again. Not the life I planned at 20, but the life I choose at 33. This is what I want." His arms came around her then, fierce and protective. "Even though it's hard, even though there'll be more fires, more disasters, more losses." "Especially then," she murmured against his chest. "That's when we need each other most." They stood holding each other in the quiet kitchen, drawing strength for whatever came next. Finally, Jonas pulled back, a wry smile touching his lips. "The barn raising's Saturday. Martha Hendricks asked specifically if you'd help organize the women's side of things." "Of course she did," Maribeth laughed. "I'll need to start cooking tomorrow. Will you butcher one of the chickens?" "Already planned on it, and I'll donate some of our lumber stock." He grew serious again. "We're blessed. Maribeth, good land, solid house, more than enough to share. Seems only right to spread it around." This was why she loved him, Maribeth thought. Not the passionate romance of youth, but this steady kindness, this understanding that abundance meant responsibility to others. Saturday dawned bright and hot. By sunrise, wagons were arriving at the Hendricks place, loaded with lumber, tools, and food. The men set immediately to work, the sound of hammers and saws filling the air. The women commandeered the house and yard, setting up tables, managing children, preparing to feed the workers. Maribeth found herself naturally in charge, directing operations with calm efficiency. Callie shadowed her, learning the rhythms of community work, how to keep coffee constantly brewing, how to organize shifts so no one got overtired, how to manage supplies so everyone ate well. "Mama Beth," Callie said during a brief lull. "Is this what family means, everyone helping?" "This is what community means," Maribeth corrected gently. "Family is smaller, closer, but in places like this, community becomes a kind of family too." She watched Jonas working alongside the other men, shirt off in the heat, muscles moving smoothly as he helped raise a beam. 3 years ago, she couldn't have imagined finding such attraction again, feeling that flutter of appreciation for a man's strength. Now it seemed natural as breathing this mixture of desire and companionship, passion and friendship. "You're mooning," Martha Hendricks said dryly, appearing at her elbow with the baby. Maribeth blushed but didn't deny it. "Can't a woman appreciate her husband's hard work?" "Course she can." Martha's smile was knowing. "Especially when that husband looks at her the way yours does when he thinks no one's watching, like you hung the moon and taught it to shine." "Martha, I'm saying thank you," the other woman continued firmly. "Not just for the other day, but for bringing light back to the Reddick house. Jonas was like a ghost after Ruth passed. Now look at him laughing with the men, building for the future. That's your doing." "It's our doing," Maribeth corrected. "All three of us, healing together." By afternoon, the barn's frame stood proud against the sky. Children ran between the workers' legs. Women called jokes to their husbands, and the whole scene hummed with life and purpose. This was what they built out here. Maribeth thought not just structures, but connections that could weather any storm. As the sun began to sink, the barn stood complete but for shingling that could be finished later. Tom Hendricks, bandages still visible under his shirt, stood before it with tears running down his face. "Don't know how to thank you all," he said roughly. "This morning I had nothing but ashes. Now you have a barn." Jonas said simply, "Next time. Could be any of us needing help. That's how it works." The gathering became a celebration, then fiddles appearing, dancing beginning despite exhausted muscles, children playing hide-and-seek in the new barn's shadows. Maribeth found herself pulled into a reel, passed from partner to partner, laughing breathlessly. When she finally escaped, flushed and happy, she found Jonas waiting with cool water and that look Martha had mentioned, like she was everything good in his world. "Dance with me," he requested, pulling her back toward the music. "Jonas, I'm exhausted." "One dance." His hands were gentle but insistent. "Let me show off my beautiful wife." They swayed together to a slower tune, ignoring the knowing looks from neighbors. Callie spun past with one of the Hendricks boys, face bright with joy. "Look what we built." Jonas murmured in her ear, "Not the barn, this community, family, future." "We didn't build it," she corrected softly. "We joined it, became part of something that was already here, waiting." "You became part of it. I was just existing, like you said, until you." She pulled back to look at his face. "We saved each other, that's the truth of it." He spun her gently, there in the gathering darkness with their neighbors around them and their daughter laughing nearby. "Best bargain I ever made. One mended coat for a mended life." "For 2 mended lives," she corrected, and reached up to kiss him there in front of everyone, not caring who saw or what they'd say. Let them talk, she thought. Let them see that love could come again, that broken hearts could heal, that sometimes God's plan involved detours that led to exactly where you needed to be. The music played on. The new barn stood solid against the stars, and somewhere in the darkness, a child called out Mama Beth with joy instead of pain. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Later, riding home with Callie sleeping between them again, Maribeth watched the familiar landmarks pass in moonlight. The path that had seemed so foreign that first winter day was now the road home. The house that had felt haunted was now filled with laughter. The man beside her, once a stranger united only by grief, was now her partner in all things. "Penny for your thoughts," Jonas said softly. "Just thinking about patterns," she replied. "How things that seem random at the time make sense looking back. Like stitches in a quilt, you can't see the design until you step away." "And what's our design?" She considered, then smiled. "I think we're still stitching it, but it's going to be beautiful." His hand found hers across Callie's sleeping form, squeezed gently. "Already is." And in the quiet night, traveling home together, Maribeth had to agree. It already was. Spring arrived again, marking a full year since Jonas and Maribeth had married. The house beyond the ridge had settled into comfortable rhythms, morning coffee shared in companionable silence, Callie's chatter over breakfast, evenings by the fire with books and sewing. But this particular morning brought change in the form of a letter. "It's from Adelaide," Jonas said, recognizing the precise handwriting. He opened it with the wariness of a man approaching a spooked horse. Maribeth continued kneading bread, but her attention was fully on her husband's changing expression as he read. "What does she say?" "They're coming for a visit. 2 weeks hence, and—" He paused, rereading. "They're bringing someone, a cousin of Ruth's, recently widowed, a young woman named Miss Catherine Wells." The implications hung heavy in the morning air. Maribeth's hand stilled on the dough. "Ah, Beth. No, I understand." She resumed kneading with perhaps more force than necessary. "They want to see if you might prefer a younger model, someone who could give you more children, someone more like Ruth." Jonas crossed to her in 2 strides, turned her to face him with floury hands and all. "Stop that! You're my wife, my choice. Our life together isn't some garment to be exchanged for a newer fashion." She searched his face, finding only sincerity. "But wouldn't you want—" "I want what we have," he said firmly. "You, me, Callie. This life we've built. That's enough. More than enough. It's everything." The kiss he gave her left no room for doubt, and Callie's disgusted noise from the doorway, "Must you do that at breakfast?" broke the tension. Still, as the visit approached, Maribeth found herself taking extra care making new curtains, having Jonas paint the fence, preparing the best rooms, not from insecurity, she told herself, but simple pride in their home. The stage arrived on a brilliant Tuesday, disgorging not 3 but 4 passengers. Adelaide emerged first, as imposing as ever, followed by Theodore and a young woman who could only be Miss Wells. The 4th passenger made Maribeth's heart skip a small boy of perhaps 4 years, clinging to Miss Wells's skirts. "Grandmother," Callie flew across the yard, propriety forgotten in joy. Adelaide's stern face softened as she embraced her granddaughter. "Callista Callie," she corrected herself. "How you've grown, and speaking of growth." She turned to Jonas and Maribeth. "May I present my late niece's daughter, Miss Catherine Wells, and her son, Timothy." Catherine Wells was everything Maribeth wasn't, perhaps 25. Corn silk hair, delicate features that spoke of city breeding, but her eyes held a familiar shadow, the look of someone acquainted with loss. "Mrs. Reddick," Catherine said, her voice soft but steady. "I've heard so much about you from Aunt Adelaide's letters. How you've cared for Callie, made a new family. It gives me hope that such things are possible." The genuine warmth in her words eased some of Maribeth's tension. This wasn't a rival. This was another woman seeking solid ground after the earth had shifted beneath her feet. They settled the guests in, Jonas and Theodore escaping to discuss horses while the women navigated the delicate social waters. Timothy, shy at first, was soon following Callie around like a puppy as she showed him her treasures, the kitten's cats now, her sewing projects, the best climbing trees. He's been so withdrawn since his father's passing, Catherine confided, watching the children through the window. This is the most animated I've seen him in months. Children help each other in ways adults can't, Maribeth observed. Callie was the same after her mother died. Sometimes they need someone who understands without asking questions. Adelaide, who had been suspiciously quiet, finally spoke. I told Catherine about your situation, how you and Jonas found each other through mutual loss, built something new. She's considering relocating west. Not here, Catherine said quickly, color rising in her cheeks. I mean, not to Dove Hollow specifically, but somewhere with possibilities. Somewhere Timothy can grow up with space to run. Understanding dawned. This wasn't about Jonas at all. This was Adelaide's way of helping another family member, using the Reddicks as an example of hope after loss. There's a new town starting up about 30 miles south. Jonas offered at dinner, having caught on as well. Looking for businesses, families, good land, access to the railroad, a young widow with Eastern connections could do well there. I have some capital from my husband's estate, Catherine admitted. I'd thought perhaps a small store or a boarding house for travelers. The conversation turned to practical matters: land prices, building costs, the challenges and rewards of frontier life. Maribeth found herself liking Catherine more with each passing hour. The woman had steel beneath the silk, a practical mind behind the pretty face. That evening, after the children were abed Timothy on a pallet in Callie's corner, the two whispering secrets like old friends. The adults sat on the porch watching stars emerge. I owe you an apology, Adelaide said suddenly to Maribeth. My motives in bringing Catherine weren't entirely pure. I wanted to see if Jonas would be swayed by youth and beauty. Mother Morrison, Catherine protested. You said we were coming to see family, to learn about Western opportunities. That too, Adelaide said calmly. But I needed to know if my granddaughter's situation was truly stable. She turned to Jonas and Maribeth. I have my answer. The way you work together, speak without words, share the load that's real marriage. That's what Callie needs to see, to learn. And what I need to see, Catherine added softly, that it's possible to love again after loss, to build again after everything falls apart. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds and owl calling, wind in the pines, the distant yip of coyotes. Then Jonas spoke, his voice thoughtful. First year Ruth and I were married, we sat on this same porch planning our future, going to have 6 children, build a bigger barn, maybe start a horse breeding operation, dreams as big as the sky. He paused, took Maribeth's hand. Life didn't follow that plan, but sitting here now, with Beth, with Callie safe inside, with new friends finding their way, this is better than any dream I could have made up. Even without those 6 children, Adelaide asked, not unkindly. Even so, Jonas said firmly. Some things aren't meant to be. Others come as surprises you didn't know to wish for. Maribeth squeezed his hand, understanding flowing between them. They'd had this conversation privately, about whether to try for children together. The conclusion, if it happened, they'd welcome it, but their family was already complete. The visit lasted 3 more days, filled with activity. Catherine took notes on everything: how Maribeth preserved vegetables, how Jonas managed livestock, how the community functioned. Timothy bloomed under Callie's attention, the two becoming inseparable. She'd make a wonderful teacher, Catherine observed, watching Callie patiently show Timothy how to hold a fishing pole. Has she mentioned any dreams for when she's older? Many, Maribeth laughed. They change weekly. Teacher, nurse, horse trainer, baker. Last week she wanted to be a traveling seamstress like the ones in her storybooks. All possibilities out here. Jonas added, that's what I want her to know, she can choose her own path. The morning of departure brought tears from the children and promises to write. Catherine pressed a card into Maribeth's hand. My late husband's family owns a textile business in Chicago. If you ever need quality fabric, thread, anything for your sewing, please write wholesale prices for family. She smiled. And you are family now, I think. Adelaide's goodbye was more formal but no less warm. You've given me peace, she told Maribeth quietly. I can see Ruth's daughter is loved. Jonas is healing, and life goes on. That's all a grandmother can ask. You'll always be welcome, Maribeth assured her. Callie needs her grandmother's stories, her connection to her mother's family. Next summer, Adelaide promised, we'll come for a proper long visit. As the stage pulled away, Timothy waving frantically from the window, Callie stood between Jonas and Maribeth, one hand in each of theirs. I'm glad they came, she announced, but I'm gladder they're going. Callie, Maribeth chided gently, that's not polite. But it's true, the child insisted. I love grandmother, and Timothy's nice, but this is our family. Just us three. That's perfect. Jonas lifted her up, settling her on his hip despite her protests that she was too big. When did you get so wise? When you and Mama Beth showed me how, she said simply. That night, their own again, the house felt especially peaceful. They moved through evening routines with the ease of long practice, Jonas reading aloud, while Maribeth mended and Callie practiced her letters. The lantern burned steady in the window, a beacon of home. I've been thinking, Maribeth said as they prepared for bed, about Catherine's shop idea. What if we expanded my sewing, not just mending, but making new clothes, special orders, with her fabric connections? You want to start a business? Jonas asked, interested rather than dismissive. Maybe, a small one. Something I could do from home, around Callie's schedule. There's need more families moving to the area all the time. I think it's brilliant, he said, drawing her close. My wife, the businesswoman. Our daughter, the assistant seamstress, she added. She's getting skilled enough to help with simple tasks. They planned quietly in the darkness, dreams modest but real. A cutting table in the spare room, trips to town for fittings, maybe eventually a shop space. Not the grand plans of youth, but the careful hopes of those who'd learned to value the possible over the perfect. Jonas, Maribeth said sleepily, thank you. For what? For choosing us, when you could have had someone younger, someone who could give you those 6 children, someone. He silenced her with a kiss. I chose love, he said simply. Not youth or possibility or someone else's idea of perfect. I chose you, and I'd choose you again every morning for the rest of my days. She tucked her head against his shoulder, listening to his heartbeat steady. Sure, hers. Outside. Wind sang through the pines, carrying the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. In the morning, there would be coffee and conversation, chores and laughter, the ordinary magic of a life rebuilt from broken pieces. The threads of their separate griefs had been woven into something new, not a replacement for what was lost, but a creation all its own. The lantern burned on through the night, its light a quiet declaration. Here lives a family, not perfect, not without scars, but whole and healing and home. And, in her corner, Callie dreamed of teaching other children, of sewing beautiful dresses, of all the ways a girl could grow when planted in love's good soil. While in their room, Jonas and Maribeth held each other close. 2 souls who'd learned that sometimes the best patterns were the ones you never planned, stitched together with patience and hope and the endless possibility of tomorrow. The house stood solid against the darkness, filled with the quiet breathing of contentment. And somewhere in the walls, perhaps, 2 ghosts smiled Samuel and Ruth, seeing their loved ones not moving on but moving forward, carrying memory gently while embracing whatever grace tomorrow might bring. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, loss, and new beginnings in the Old West. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share your location in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts about Maribeth and Jonas's journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit the hype button to help more people discover these tales of frontier life. Your support means the world and helps keep these stories alive for everyone who loves the spirit of the American West.